Okay. Welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming out here on a snowy night. My name is Stephen Payne. I'm the director of the Bronx County Historical Society. How many people have been to this museum before tonight? Few of you? Well, welcome those who haven't. This is the Museum of Bronx History. It's located in the second oldest house in the Bronx, and it intersects in tremendous ways with the topic of tonight's lecture. This house was primarily built by enslaved Africans. Isaac Valentine was the original owner, a European blacksmith in the area. And there's a lot that could be said about the history of this house alone. Obviously, that's not the topic of tonight's lecture, but it's very appropriate that the topic of tonight's lecture will be taking place in this house. So just want to acknowledge a little bit the history of this house before we proceed. And also want to give a plug for those of you who have been here, those of you who haven't been here, check out all of our events and exhibits. You can check it out online. bronxhistory.org is the address. There's also newsletters that are right out in the hallway. You can pick up a copy. This one just came out in February. It has just a sampling of some of our events and an article on Bronx history each time, and an upcoming exhibit in April. So check it out. Let us know if you have any questions. Always love any of you all who appreciate our events. If you want to become members, that's a great thing too. So you can talk to either Roger or myself afterwards, and we can let you know how to do that. And yeah, welcome everyone. Now I'm going to shut up, and I'm going to introduce our Director of Education, Roger McCormick, who will continue on.
Thank you all for coming so much. So the lecture is Black-Owned Land in the Bronx in the early 1800s. It's my great pleasure to introduce Keith Doherty, who was a former professor of history and art history at Boston University, where he earned his doctorate and taught for 14 years. Since returning to his native New York in 2012, he has authored several articles and a short book on the early history of the Bronx and Westchester, with a special focus on black-owned farms in the area at the turn of the 19th century. In addition to his academic work, he is a researcher as well as an educator at the Phillips Manor Hall in Yonkers, and he leads tours of several parts of Manhattan for the Big Onion Touring Company. So Keith, thank you for coming. Take it away.
Thank you. Okay. Well, are we gonna?
Oh, please
Okay.
hold all your questions until the end.
Oh, yes.
I was
Please, if we could
tell you.
save questions for the end, I appreciate it. Well, thank you, Roger, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Stephen Payne, for inviting me down here. I've always been like a real admirer of the Valentine's Variant House. You know, I work at the Phillips Manor Hall in Yonkers, which is very, very closely related to it historically and in other ways. So it's really a pleasure to be here. It's hard to believe that the densely populated urban environment that is the Bronx today was ever farmland, open farmland, but so it was for about 200 years, beginning with the likes of Jonas Bronk and Adrian van der Donck in the mid-1600s or so, right up to the mid-1800s, when things began to shift from being an agricultural community toward a more urban community. As more and more historians have been acknowledging in recent years, the hard work of creating and operating those early farms was largely performed by enslaved Africans. Slavery was widespread and commonplace here for at least 150 years and not seriously challenged until the early 1800s, when a long, slow process known as Gradual Emancipation began. This lasted for like 30 years. Eventually, abolition was achieved, but until around 1827. An extraordinary thing happened during this period, the early part of the 19th century, the early 1800s, right up until that 1850 and beyond. A number of individuals, nearly all of whom had been enslaved in their youth or forced into involuntary servitude, managed not only to gain their freedom, but to purchase land of their own in various parts of the Bronx, cultivating it on their own terms and for their own profit. Humble though these parcels typically were, and they were humble, they were small, and usually not, the best farmland, their importance was inestimable for various reasons. In addition to being just about the only potential avenue to a sustainable financial future for Black people in this very precarious time, they were also the only way for Black men to vote. After 1821, a provision was put into the state constitution that said that unless a Black man owned $250 worth of property, he could not vote. And that provision remained in the New York State Constitution until 1870. So owning land was a critical thing. It wasn't just about financial security, it was also about suffrage. This is to say nothing of the symbolic importance of a formerly enslaved population buying property, which conferred a kind of social legitimacy in the eyes of many and confounded ingrained white assumptions about the proper place and abilities of Black people. In many ways, this generation, this first abolition generation, embodied the hopes and dreams of what many Black leaders like to call the rising generation. They were the rising generation. And I'm showing you on the screen a very rare image of an early Black farmer. His name was James Minkerson. He was actually had a farm in Marlboro, New Jersey, but because pictures of early Black farmers are so rare, I'm using him. He's with his mother, Shema, in front of their, relatively humble house, which is probably typical of the kinds of houses that Black farmers lived in. And I'm also showing you a picture that I really like. It's a portrait of Rosa Royale, who was a niece of a prosperous Black stevedore. A stevedore is someone who supervises the loading and unloading of ships. A man named Samuel Walker, who owned a home and a large piece of property in the Williamsbridge neighborhood. And she is dressed as a proper bourgeois debutante of the day. And so, but to get back to Black property owning and what it means. Students of the city's Black history are likely familiar with like Seneca Village in Manhattan, presumably. People are aware of Seneca Village. There was also Wheatsville and Brooklyn, two exceptionally successful and well-appointed early Black landowning communities. But what most don't realize is that Black land ownership was not limited to a few oases like Seneca and Weeksville. Indeed, it was relatively widespread in various areas outside of Manhattan that were still rural at this time, albeit on a smaller scale. So properties like the ones we're about to look at were not part of large self-sustaining communities like Seneca, where Black landowners were wealthy and powerful enough to build their own churches, build their own schools, etc. These were smaller communities and smaller properties. They were isolated and outnumbered, overshadowed by adjacent white properties on all sides. As a result, they were forced to cooperate with and accommodate their often unfriendly white neighbors to a much greater degree. So it's a very different experience than Seneca and Weeksville, but much more common, a much more common situation. And yet no one talks about these kinds of farms. So we're going to change that trend, because in fact, they were quite common. Another thing I would like to point out, in the first half of the 19th century, fully 4/5 of the Black population of New York State lived outside of Manhattan. Okay, so this is an extremely large group of people that no one has studied in any real detail outside of Seneca. In any case, so the potential power of rural land ownership could confer on a Black family was not lost on Manhattan's leading abolitionists, including people like the first Black physician in New York City, James McCune Smith, the ministers, Samuel Cornish and Charles V. Ray, the philanthropist Gerrit Smith over here, scary looking individual, and even for a time, Frederick Douglass himself. They all became outspoken advocates of country life, urging young Black city dwellers to relocate to the country and buy some property. After all, it was only in the country that property was cheap enough to be purchased by black families. For some of these leaders, it was about getting the vote. It was about economic security. For others, it was about physical health. The physician, McCune Smith, was very much about getting outside of the city and being healthier. And for still others, especially the Reverend Cornish over there, it was about spiritual and moral uplift. You're away from the vices of the city, right? Alcohol, all of those things. So, the Bronx. So, we know, I know, that in the course of the 19th century or the 1800s, there were quite a number of black-owned properties in the Bronx. Places like Unionport, Morrisania, Williamsbridge, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not trying to present a comprehensive picture of black land ownership in the Bronx. It's actually not possible. I was talking to a couple of people before the lecture. Statistics on farms were not kept by the federal government at so early a stage. We're talking about, like 1800 to 1850. So the way I have found these farms basically is just by going line by line through censuses and paging through old deeds, which is a very painstaking process. However, it was not long before I came across several black land owners. And what this is showing me, and this was a surprise for me, and I think it's been a surprise to a lot of other people, is that black land ownership was not a terribly uncommon thing. I think that many people believe that because abolition was still going on, or had only just happened, that black land ownership was a rare thing or an unheard of thing. It was not. It was not. So, I found a bunch of properties, but I'm going to choose significant ones. Number one, these two right here. Number one, because they had not been discussed historically until now. Okay. Number two, they're exceptionally early in date. And number three, they represent two very different eras of Bronx history. And before we get into them, quick note on geography. I don't want to get too dry or boring, but the Bronx, of course, was not the Bronx in the early 1800s. It consisted of a bunch of little, municipalities. There was West Farms. There was something called Morrisania down in the southwest corner, right on the Harlem River, and so on. But the major town, okay, that corresponds to most of what is now like the Southeast Bronx, was called Westchester. Okay, we know it today as a county, but back then it was a big town, and it corresponded to over half of the Bronx. And it turns out that both the majority of the black landowners that I've located were in this town of Westchester. That doesn't exist anymore. Okay, so the earlier of the two properties, right there, was an extensive 40-acre farm in the Pelham Parkway area of the East Bronx. The farm was built up gradually between 1770 and 1815 by a man who was actually mixed race, named Dennis Hetty, who we'll talk about in a moment. The second that I want to talk about was a planned residential neighborhood that included at least 5 families, black landowning families, and it was called Schuylerville. Today, people would call it like Pelham Bay, okay? Two very different situations and two very different chapters of Bronx's history, and so they're good to talk about together. In any case, Dennis Hetty. I've been researching black land ownership for like 3 years right now. This man is one of the most impressive individuals I have encountered. Not only did he own property at an extremely early date, I'm talking about 1770, okay? When virtually all black and mixed race people in New York were still in bondage. But he managed to grow this property steadily for over the course of like 50 years to at least 10 times its original size and original value. And it corresponds today to the area around Eastchester Avenue and Eastchester, ooh, this is really washed out. Eastchester Avenue and Pelham Parkway, Jacoby Hospital. This was the home of Dennis Hetty. Looks like this now. It's a parking lot of Jacoby Hospital. Okay, but this is where Dennis Hetty's house was. You may be asking me, how do I know? Where Dennis Hetty's house was, and I'll just show you how smart I am. Nick Dembowski and I, who works at the Van Cortlandt House Museum, there are no maps, okay, from Dennis Hetty's time, Dennis Haddon's time. However, there are maps from slightly later, like 1860 or so, and we happen to know that Dennis Hetty's heirs, his children, sold Hetty's land to a guy called Claiborne Ferris. And we know where Claiborne Ferris's land was, okay, because he shows up in later maps, right? Okay, how do I pinpoint it? Onto Jacoby Hospital? Well, certain roads that existed in Claiborne Ferris's day still exist today. Okay, like Eastchester Avenue, like the Williamsbridge Road. Okay, and that's so I kind of triangulated and I came up with the Jacoby Hospital parking lot. So, I mean, this is lost history, but it's not really lost. You just have to kind of dig and think a little bit. Okay, so although Hetty would have been regarded as black in the eyes of the law, he was a mixed-race man whose father was his former white enslaver, a man named Thomas Haddon, and his mother, another of Haddon's enslaved, a woman named Rose. Extraordinarily, his father, this man Thomas Haddon, fully acknowledged that Dennis, along with several other children that he had by Rose, were his own, in spite of the fact that he was married to a white woman all of the while. In his will, and I'm showing you his will right here, Haddon specified that Dennis and the other children that he had by Rose, and there were about 6 of them, each receive an inheritance of about 25 pounds, which works out to about $7,000 apiece. And he also stipulated that each be granted their freedom, of course, and that they be taught to read and trained in some sort of trade. So these are the literal quotes. I will give to my Negro children, excuse the antiquated language. Amos, Lazarus, Dennis, Jacob, Glover, sum of 25 pounds, and they must all be exempted from slavery and learn to read and write and be trained. This is pretty unusual. I only know of actually one case where an enslaver is acknowledging children by an enslaved woman that he owns. The Haddon family owned a lot of property in the Bronx, but also especially in what is now Scarsdale, lovely town up in Westchester. Much of this land was purchased by Thomas Haddon himself, and a colonial era inn that many believe was owned by Thomas Haddon still stands in Scarsdale. And if this was Haddon's inn, and it probably was, it's called the Wayside Cottage. You can't get in, you have to know the right people, give them a call, whatever, but you can get in there. It took me a while, I got it. If it's a place where a young Dennis Hetty or Haddon would have spent much of his time, along, of course, with his mother, Rose. As an enslaved woman, Rose would probably have spent most of her time in the kitchen, out of sight of white patrons. Interestingly, at some point, shortly after Thomas Haddon's death, Dennis's last name changes from Haddon to Hetty. And the same thing happens with several of his siblings, Lazarus, Frank, Jacob. Their name becomes Hetty from Haddon. May have been a conscious choice on their part. Maybe they wanted to distance themselves from their father, or, and I think this is more likely, some relative of Thomas's after his death probably wanted to distance the Haddon family from them and asked them to change their name. I don't know. I don't know why it happened. Okay. So, although it is not mentioned in Thomas Haddon's will, it's likely that Dennis's father gave him some of the land in the Bronx initially, some portion of it. We know that Thomas purchased at least 25 acres in the vicinity of what became Dennis's farm. However, it's unlikely that Thomas gave Dennis all 25 of those acres because in 1799 tax rolls for the town of Westchester, Dennis's land is assessed at $400, which according to the prices of the day works out to like 2 acres, not 25. And a number of property deeds from 1810 to 1840 show us that Dennis expanded this initial kernel of 2 to 4 acres to about 40 acres in the course of his life. So this is about 10 or even 20 times the original size of what his father gave him. And so he was a real estate like go-getter, a magnate, okay, in 1770 as a black man. This is courage. This is courage, okay, and a really extraordinary story from my point of view. So at the time of his death, his holdings were worth about $2,200. So that's a lot more than $400, which is, so that's many times the initial assessment. He probably did not farm all of that land. Records suggest that he may have leased some of it out to white tenant farmers. Though illiterate, Dennis Haddon must have been a very savvy businessman. He probably purchased land that people regarded as worthless. What I have found when I was researching the land is that on old maps that show Dennis's land, there's lots of messages like this: liable to tide floods, meaning that Haddon's land might have been swampy, waterlogged. Okay, and I was able to confirm this incidentally, because the 49th precinct was putting an addition on the back of their building, and they had to dig into the parking lot, and they went down about 10 feet, and sure enough, it's wet down there. This was before it rained. It was gonna rain that day, so they dug down in there, and yeah, it's wet, and it's actually at the head of the Westchester Creek, which is one of the major waterways in the Bronx, Bronx River, Westchester Creek, Hutchinson River, so it makes sense that it would have been very marshy and swampy. What I suspect happened is that he took land that was swampy and found ways to develop it into a livable, arable space. He was, after all, he would have been extremely skilled, agriculturally speaking. Okay, he was raised as a farmer. He knew farming like the back of his hand. So if anybody could make this profitable, he could, and I assume he found a way. Okay. Here's the guys that I talked to. I asked them if they found any old houses down there. They said no. And they said no gold either. Yeah. Okay. Here's the Westchester Creek today. I went down a rabbit hole on the Westchester Creek, I'm sorry. I had to follow it all the way to the end, right? So I followed it all the way to the end, and you can see most of it is underground today. So you don't know it's there. But this is how the landscape is in New York City. It's all underground, right? So you just gotta figure out, so Hetty's land was at the head of the creek, where the springs were that fed it. And then most of this is underground, but it emerges right about here. And so you can see it's a pretty substantial waterway. And one thing, this is the last thing I'll say about the Westchester Creek. The one thing that I suspect happened, because, and oftentimes black landowners didn't have the best land, so they had to subsidize their income by working elsewhere. I suspect that Dennis and his children worked on the creek as well, because this was a major place of business. And black men, traditionally in New York City, worked on ships. They worked on docks, they worked on loading and unloading ships, piloting ships. It was a traditional job for a black person in New York City at the time, so I would not be surprised in the least if the Haddons were working on the creek as well as their farm. In any case, Dennis had to prove to someone in 1816 that he was in fact a free man and that he was a son of Thomas Haddon. We don't know who challenged him. We don't know, and we don't know why. We only know that this document survives. It was in the archives of the Scarsdale Historical Society. And it basically is a testimony. It's a deposition by someone named Jonathan Tompkins, who was like the mayor, de facto mayor of Scarsdale in 1816, basically swearing that he knows Dennis Haddon, who resides in the Bronx, that Dennis was here in Scarsdale, and that he was alleged to be the son of Thomas Haddon, and that Dennis and the others of Haddon's family were given free by the last will in the testament. So, I don't know why this document was created, but someone must have challenged Dennis's legal status. And it was not uncommon for black men, especially in the early 19th century, to have to carry a document like this on their person at all times, because they could be challenged at any time and accused of pretending to be a free man. This is frequent. Okay, so having something like this on your person would not have been uncommon. What I think is amazing about this document, what really strikes me about it, is this is 1816. Okay, by this date, Thomas Haddon had been a major landowner in the Bronx for like 35 years. That someone could challenge his legal status and who he was, even at this date, shows that no matter how successful you were, at that time you were black first. Okay. Well, finally, incidentally, we should note that Dennis would have been very eligible to vote. Okay, his property was worth well in excess of $250, so he would have had no trouble there. Another even more basic human right that came with freedom that Dennis took full advantage of was the ability to have a family of one's own that could remain together under the same roof for as long as each member wished. Enslaved people, of course, could never assume this, living as they did in constant fear that their mothers, children, partners could be sold out from under them at any time, in some cases, never to be seen again. Early census records tell us that Dennis and his wife, we don't have her name, unfortunately, had at least 6 children in their house between 1790 and 1810. We don't know their names, however, in his will, he refers to an Elijah, a Harry, and a Dennis, who were presumably 3 sons, but the rest of them, we don't know their names. And incidentally, one of the things I have to do with this project is figure out if there are heirs, if there are Headies around. I still, I'm not clear on that. I would love to find out. We do know that at least one son remained, Harry, and Harry had 9 children in Westchester, although he himself was not a landowner. I'm showing you an image of the Poe cottage on the concourse. It's famous because Edgar Allan Poe lived there, but just as important, and I like to say this to Roger all the time, is that it's the last surviving example of a kind of farmhouse that would have been common in the Bronx in Dennis Headey's time. So if you want to get a sense of how the Headeys lived, this is probably a very close approximation of the kind of house that they lived in. Roger very kindly helped me illustrate just how small his house is, okay? On the second floor here he is standing. Now he is a tall man, okay, so this is not, but the upper floor would have been very cramped indeed. Having 6 kids in a house like this would have been quite interesting, to say the least. No indoor plumbing, obviously.
Just like the school groups.
Yeah, exactly. So you've had a taste of this kind of thing. So in any case, so Dennis Headey died in 1840 at approximately 90 years of age, and I'm showing you his grave, which is located in the Headey family cemetery, which was established by his brother Lazarus on Lazarus's farm in the town of Newcastle, which is in Westchester. It's about just north of Scarsdale. The farm is long gone, but happily the cemetery survives. DH. There are many reasons, excuse me. Upon his death, Dennis's heirs promptly sold off the land. There are many reasons, well, it's worth $2,200, so, you know, that's one reason. There are many other reasons they may have sold, including racism, poverty. A key driver may simply have been the fact that farming was a dying industry in the Bronx in 1840, all over New York City, largely because of, you know, you had a superior, less expensive produce, other things coming from the Midwest. So you had the Erie Canal, you had the railroads and so on, and farms in New York were just outclassed. And so farms in New York were going under all over the place, not just New York City. This was especially the case in the Bronx, however, because of the encroachment of Manhattan coming north. By 1840, this was accelerated by the introduction of the Old Croton Aqueduct water, the extension of the Harlem Rail over the Harlem River, among other things. And so instead of farms in 1840, we're getting residential developments. And so it was a pretty smart decision, I think, on the part of the kids to sell the farm. There was no future in it, as you asked me. So, part two. Schuylerville. Speaking of residential communities, in addition to the Dennis Hetty farm, I want to discuss a small community of at least 5 black landowning families in what is now sort of the Pelham Bay neighborhood of East Bronx, not too far from Hetty's property, in an area that was called Schuylerville. In my last talk, I referred to it as Schuylerville to a bunch of people that are actually from the area, and they told me no one calls it Schuylerville anymore. What's the matter with you? So they said, we call ourselves Pelham Bay. I said, okay. So it's Pelham Bay now. It was Schuylerville when these families moved in. These families owned small plots, an acre or two at most, and they were part of planned residence. These were not farmers. What I suspect strongly is that they worked on the Long Island Sound. There was an enormous port of call that was connected directly to Schuylerville by a road that they called Willow Lane. Now it's called Layton Avenue, Schuylerville Dock. So I think Schuylerville was sort of a residential kind of adjunct to the Schuylerville Dock on the Sound. This is what it looks like today. This is the ruin of it. Again, I went down the rabbit hole on that, but you know, I had to find it. And I assume, again, because of the traditional association of black men with dock work and working on the city, that this is where the residents of Schuylerville made their living. The Schuylerville in general is very, very intact. Okay, it's in very good shape. We're not talking about the parking lot of Jacoby Hospital here. These houses are standing. This is just one block in Schuylerville. Vinyl siding and other unsightly modern additions notwithstanding, at least half of the homes that I saw in the neighborhood date to the period that we are talking about, and were almost certainly built by the families that we were going to be talking about. So these are all 19th century. It's hard to recognize that, you know, like all of these are all open porches originally, and the siding would have been different, but trust me, our old buildings is my thing. So, and the neighborhood itself is very much intact, with the exception of the southern edge of it, which was wiped out by the Bruckner. Robert Moses, you know, came through and knocked out the southern part of it, but all the rest of it is more or less intact. All the street names are different, but they're the same streets. So Elliott Avenue became Baisley. You may know Baisley Avenue. Throg's Neck Road became East Tremont. Willow Lane became Bruckner, and so on. But the neighborhood is still pretty well intact, which I was psyched to see. So, as I said, where am I? I went off script last time I gave this talk and I paid the price, so I'm sticking to the, okay, so in the records that I consulted, it would appear that the neighborhood was sort of half black and half Irish. This was actually a pretty common combination in this era because you had a massive influx of Irish people. They were desperately poor, so you had this Irish and free black, combination in many different parts of the city, from the Five Points to Schuylerville to Seneca Village, and so on and so forth. And there was a place called Black Dublin and Queens and so on. So this was a pretty typical situation where you had half Irish, half black. And I have been able to isolate at least 5 families. The Montgomerys, the Clapps, the Coles, the Joneses, the Nelsons, okay? They were all clustered on the eastern southern part of town. I should point out that there are probably more than 5 families. A lot of these names are common to both Irish people and free black people. Douglas, okay, Brown. I mean, these are names that Irish people often adopted for the same reason that they were anglicized from Irish names because the Irish were whatever, they were doing what they had to do. So, but the problem for me is that I don't know if John Lewis was Irish or black. You know what I mean? Right. And the same with Douglas, and the same with Brown. In some cases, these people show up in censuses, and then the race is indicated there. But a lot of them do not show up in censuses, and there's no property deed. So you could have had many other black families around here. I don't know. I was only able to determine these 5. And so the initial person to come in was a guy called Thomas Montgomery. He bought a property in 1836, and incidentally, this whole development was very slow getting off the ground. The developer didn't have any buyers for a long time, so the initial buyers to come in were free black families, and then the Irish followed. Altogether, the families span a period of about 80 years, 1836 to 1908, after which the black families start to dwindle until eventually they're gone. And I'll get into why I think that happened later on. And so again, the first to arrive is a man named Thomas Montgomery, who I was unable to find very much about. He was followed by Loretta Clapp. Loretta Clapp and her son Sylvester Clapp were actually the longest lived of the Schuylerville families. They didn't sell their properties, and they had multiple properties all along here. This plot was bought by them. This plot belonged to them, and one other. They remained for like 100 years. And I happen to know that there are Clapps actually still around. A descendant contacted me, which is I was very psyched. We had a long conversation. And the others, Richard Coles, Peter Jones, Samuel Nelson, they all of these families actually had some longevity in Schuylerville. I should point out, most are buying in the 1840s, okay, or 1830s. This map dates to 1868, okay, which means most of them remained for about 20, 30, 40 years, and the Clapps were there for like 100 years. It is very likely that all of these buyers, let's see. The essential difference, okay, from Weeksville and Seneca is that as large as the black population was in Schuylerville, they never gained the majority, as far as I can tell. And so they were not able to fund their own school, fund their own church in the manner of Seneca Village. So someone asked me in the beginning, are we going to be talking about the Seneca Village of the Bronx? And I said, sort of, not really, close. It's very likely that all of these buyers, all of these families were either enslaved or forced into involuntary servitude earlier in their lives, given the era. 1830s and 1840s, slavery was not outlawed until 1827. So certainly all of these people were enslaved at some point in their lives, and the approximate ages of everybody at the time of their purchases. Also, all of the surnames, Clapp, Coles, Montgomery, Nelson, these are the names of prominent enslavers in the New York area. It's not always the case that formerly enslaved people keep the surname of their enslaver. Many times they do not, but many times they do. So sometimes researchers use that as an index. And they were all able to vote. Okay, all of these properties were purchased for relatively little money, $50, $100, but they were also all developed by the people who bought them. So you would come, you'd spend $100, you'd get an acre, and then you would develop it. You'd build your own house. Okay, there were no architects, there were no contractors at the time. You just got a big gang of your friends together and you built your own house. And then the outhouse out back. Okay, and maybe you kept a couple of cows in the back or something like that. Okay, once it was developed, the property's value increased. And all of them had properties that were assessed eventually for well over $250. So they were all voting. Okay, so to this point, unfortunately, I lack a great deal of biographical information on the families. A case like Dennis Hetty is very exceptional. It's very rare that you know the deal for any poor person, white or black, from the early 19th century. So Dennis Hetty is an exceptional case where we have biographical information, we have multiple documents going back to his life. For the most part, for people at that time, they did not leave a paper trail. And so I don't have a great deal of information on the families. I looked through military service records. I did not see anybody that served in, say, the War of 1812 or anything like that, or the Civil War for that matter, or periodicals. They were probably local. They were probably local folks. In the deeds, they're all described as being of Westchester, of the town of Westchester, which doesn't necessarily mean they grew up in the Bronx, but that they were living in the Bronx at the time of the purchase. And they're all described in censuses as having born in New York. So probably they're local. Okay, did they necessarily grow up in Westchester? I don't know. They may have come north from Manhattan. They may have been listening to people like James McCune Smith and Frederick Douglass and Samuel Cornish and all of these leaders saying, go north, young men, and buy property in the country, Maybe that's what they were doing. I don't know. I would like to believe that. Okay. So this is Hollywood Avenue. We call it Hollywood Avenue today. It was called, I forget, I think East Tremont or something back in the day. But this is the east side of town, and this is where all of the black families lived, and several houses in this part of the neighborhood clearly date to that time. Trust me, especially something like that. Okay, little humble two-story cottage with a full-length porch in the front, something like that. These are typical 1840, 1830 cottages. I'm not going to go so far as to say this was Clapp's house and this was Montgomery's house and that kind of stuff, but certainly one of those families built that house. I will say that. And there's certainly, this is certainly the stretch, because you see Mr. Coles, Mr. Clapp, Mr. McCall, people that we know were black families right next to school number 9. The school is still there. It's a lot bigger. Okay, they've rebuilt it several times. The school is still there. And so, this is certainly the spot. Here we go. I resisted the urge to, knock on the doors, especially this guy. Don't tread on me flag outside the town. I'm not gonna tread on you. So yeah. So this is a map, the Sanborn Fire Insurance map. It's It dates to about 1898. So this is, this is well after most of the families had already left Schuylerville, but it shows that several of the houses are still standing at this time in 1898. Okay, and on this 1898 map, in plan at least, they look exactly like the houses that we just looked at. These two-story deals with a little porch. Okay. Scandal. Scandal comes to Schuylerville. Like I said, I haven't been able to find a great deal of biographical information on the Schuylerville families, with one exception. Sylvester Clapp. Okay, this is the son of Loretta Clapp, who was the second of the two families to come to Schuylerville. And Sylvester apparently married an Irish woman named Mary Bowers. And this is an extreme, racism was institutionalized, ingrained in everything in this era. And they had a name for interracial couples. It's called miscegenation. Another word they used was amalgamation. Okay, and for racists everywhere, bigots everywhere, this was a horror. Sylvester and Mary's marriage was unacceptable to an individual who would not identify him or herself. They signed themselves Toxin. It was a fake name, and they sent letters to all of the newspapers in New York at the time saying, "Do you know that a black man and a white woman are married in Schuylerville?" And so the reporter came to Schuylerville and decided to confront Sylvester and Mary. And the article is very interesting. I mean, the first, the subhead here says, "The easygoing citizens of Schuylerville are mildly surprised that inquiries should be made at all." Okay, and the impression you get actually from the article is that Schuylerville could care less about this. It's the outsiders that are making the problem. And this article, I think, dates to 1882. At this point, the Clapps had been in Schuylerville for like 50 years. Now, no one's going to have a problem with Sylvester Clapp at this point, except this anonymous letter writer, Deep Throat, whatever she wants to call this. And then in the article, it's interesting. I broke out a couple of quotes. Let's go back for a second. The reporter has been told in the village of Westchester, a few miles below Pelham, there was a case where a man and wife were communicants in the Episcopal Church there. And so we went to the Reverend Mr. Johnson. It's interesting because they don't interview Sylvester at all. They go to the Reverend, the local Reverend of the Episcopal Church, of St. Peter's Church. And the reporter says, is there such a case in this village? The Reverend Johnson said, yes, there is, but these people are not parishioners of my church. That's a lie. They are. I found lots of reverends. So the Reverend is lying to the reporter about that. Sylvester Clapp and his Irish wife have raised a family of 4 and have children of excellent reputation. The man is a day laborer and the woman an industrious, respectable Irish woman. Irish people were despised at this time. So this is code for, she's not a drunk. She does, she's acceptable. So the reporter is actually trying to give a balanced picture. Of course, says the Reverend Johnson, such marriages are greatly to be deprecated, chiefly on account of the trouble and sorrow they bring sooner or later. Should anyone appeal to me to perform such a marriage, I should certainly do all in my power to persuade the persons not to make that contract. I do not, however, consider that it's a question for the church. I think these cases are isolated, and it should be a question for politicians to deal with. I will, however, say that there are 1 or 2 cases like this in nearly every community, and I think that Toxin, this is the deep throat, letter writer, will have some trouble in finding a neighborhood in which he will not be offended by the existence of this miscegenation. So here's a, this is, I just read this. And I just read that as well. So I mean, it's very interesting. On the one hand, you have this reverend acknowledging that the miscegenation is happening. On the other hand, he feels compelled to lie that they're parishioners in his church. So it's sort of a strange issue. And he's also saying that nobody in the neighborhood seems to care. And I wonder if that's completely the case. You know, I'm sure I'm sure they faced plenty of scrutiny, plenty of people that wanted to wag their finger at them, or at least talk about them, you know, behind their back. But the marriage was very successful, and they had plenty of children, all of whom went on to do very well. I am showing you, and by the way, this is what I was talking about. Here's the Reverend Johnson's church, St. Paul's Episcopal. Okay, it's still standing. It's in like Cortona Park, like Claremont, kind of far from Schuylerville, but it was integrated, definitely integrated, because the baptismal records and the marriage records and the burial records and everything survives for this church. And it includes a notation for the baptisms of Mary and Julia Clapp in 1865 and 1864, respectively. Okay, that article was in 1882, by which time the Clapps had been parishioners for like 20 years. Like, you definitely weren't. Going to the census really quickly. Census tells an interesting story. It really tells us kind of the whole deal. Okay, you have Sylvester Clapp, 44. He is male. He is M. Not black, not white, mulatto. This is 1870. By the time you get to 1870, census takers, this is not Dennis Headey's day. This is, we've moved on from Dennis Headey, when everybody was either black or white. Now you've got mulatto, which is a mix. So apparently Sylvester himself was a mix of black and white, or a mix of some kind. The descendant that I met tells me that the Clapps were part Indian, or part Native American. It's the Siwanoi Indian, which is a people that, a tribe that was in Queens, I think, in what we call now Queens. So he may have had a lot of Native American blood. In any case, he's classed as mulatto. He is a laborer. And again, by the way, this is what we see for black men at the time. Never carpenter, never blacksmith, never stevedore. The crafts, the trades were, closed to black men, by and large. Okay, people, if you were a blacksmith and you were part of a guild and you were training new people, they would not take black apprentices. They would not. This was one of the things that really killed black landowning, is that they were always forced to remain laborers on the lowest rungs of the ladder. So he's classed as a laborer. However, he owns property that's worth $2,500. He inherited it from his mother. He's got a personal estate worth $300, and he's born in New York. His wife, Mary, is female, and she is W. She's white, and she's keeping house, okay? And she was born in Ireland. Their children, Leosetta, Louisa, Mary, and Julia, all girls, okay? Were all born in New York. Mary and Julia are the ones in this record, okay, being baptized at St. Paul's. They are all attending school. What I assume is that the school that we saw in those maps became integrated by this time, by 1870. Integration of schools and churches was not a given by any chance, by any stretch of the imagination, but it happened more often than you might think. I have been surprised in my research to see integration of churches and schools from a very early date. That's something that I think people assume did not happen until much later, but evidently it did. Now, just because they were integrated doesn't mean that things were equal. Okay, there might have been very different treatment for black and white within the church. certainly there was different seating arrangements, segregated seating in churches for a long time. But that remains to be seen. So in conclusion, and I should talk about why Schuylerville kind of, fell apart as a black community. Black families stopped settling in Schuylerville by about 1850. Okay, at that point, we don't see any more purchases by black families. Whereafter, their numbers steadily dwindle. They're outnumbered by the Irish until by the 1820s, until by the 20th century, only the Klebs remain. I think this is a result of racism. In deeds and censuses, we always find various skilled professions listed for the Irish homeowners, from blacksmith to shoemaker to carpenter to baker. But for black residents, we see only laborer, okay, or domestic servant for women. Once in a while, you'll see coachman, a guy who drives a coach or something. Throughout the 19th century, you find white craftsmen unwilling to train black men in their trade. Even at the Eastchester dock, I suspect that black men were not promoted to sort of upper positions like navigators. Very likely, they found themselves in time unable to pay property taxes and were forced to sell as a result. But this, again, I need to clarify this, but I believe that's how it went. So in conclusion, we can see that together, the Dennis Haddon Farm, the Schuylerville community were two very different responses to the two different changing economic reality of the Bronx in the 19th century. Of course, buying and maintaining property would have been fraught with difficulties for black people in the era, given that racism, abolition or no, was still heavily institutionalized and habitually expressed in a variety of economic and other ways. Still, as mentioned, these properties are only a few of what were a number of black-owned parcels in the Bronx and elsewhere in other parts of the city. They show that the spectrum of opportunities available to black people in the period were broader than many of us imagine, I believe. No doubt these landowners, their hopes buoyed by the demise of slavery, believed that a great era lay ahead for their people. As we know, these hopes were dashed in many ways. But the existence of these stories, and there's lots of them, shows that for a brief shining moment, the future seemed bright. In the end, the act of buying land was much more than a financial transaction. It was much more even than a way of just getting the vote. There was a common sentiment in the age, much as there is now, that land owning conferred a kind of legitimacy on a person and a true claim to citizenship. There was an ethos of land owning that said that by acquiring property, a person proved their worthiness. In this sense, the Headies, the Claps, the other families in the East Bronx we've discussed embody the promise of abolition by confounding long ingrained ideas about the proper place of black society, black people in society, ultimately making a powerful statement of power, agency, and independence in the very shadow of slavery. Thank you.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you.
And now we'll turn it over for questions in the audience. I'm sure
Yes,
there are
ma'am.
many.
Just to clarify, was the referend white? And I think you kind of spoke on the conjecture about why he chose to lie in the article. Was it to protect the family?
I really haven't speculated on his motivation. I don't know if he was protecting the family or protecting himself. I suspect the latter. I suspect there was probably still some, lingering racism or opposition to integration in the church. I wouldn't be surprised at all. But I think perhaps in the press, at the level of press, he wanted to play that down, covering his, what.
He didn't want to lose his church.
There you go.
He would have lost his church.
Look, it may have been the wise decision. May have been the necessary decision.
Toxin would send one of those letters to the cardinals and so on and so
Mhm.
forth. He may have lost his church.
Right. Right. Yes, sir.
Early on, you have to be a landowner in order to vote.
Yeah.
Did that fall away at some point, or were they buying land so that they could vote?
I don't know if that was necessarily the case here, but in a lot of my other research, the land, although they buy it for relatively little money, comes to be assessed at exactly $250. And so they developed it, black landowners often would develop it just to the point that it was worth $250. And what that tells me is that, yeah, they're buying the land so they can vote.
I'd like to add something.
Yes, please do.
A little known piece of history that corresponds with that is when the priest was saying that he'd find in a lot of neighborhoods, a lot of communities,
Yeah.
that mixed marriage type of thing. One of the reasons for that at that time is because many of the Irish were also black. And even because it's written down as Irish because they're from Ireland, so that's their nationality, it doesn't mean they were fair-skinned or Caucasian. Many of the Irish were just as black as I am, just as brown as she is, but they were just Irish because they were from Ireland. So of course you will find marriage mixes and mingling like that a lot because they were both black, just from different countries. And that was the case all over the place. Many of the British early were mulattoes,
Yeah.
many of the Irish, many of the French, so on and so forth.
I'm sure there's a whole unwritten history about that.
It's written.
It's written.
It is written.
You gotta give me some bibliography.
It's like this history, it's just not put into the general discourse. And so the questions and the research are not done because no one knows there's a question to ask. But if anybody here can Google Benjamin Franklin's letter after he took a tour abroad, and he wrote back to George Washington, and he clearly said the Irish are black, the French are black, the German are black. He said only I think he said the English or the Saxons. He said only the Saxons are wholly Caucasian. He said the rest of them are black.
Very interesting.
Y'all can Google it.
Other questions? Yes.
Have you been able to find any link between the Scatterville black landowner community and it wasn't called Centerville AME at the time, I forget what its older name was, but there was a African Methodist Episcopal church in the area of today's Parkchester that was built maybe 1848, something like that. There was a little community around there too, but I know the burials were all relocated up to Westchester. I'm curious now, I wanna see if there's any of the names of the, reinterred families and headstones that are tied to.
So where was this community? In
was
Portchester?
the area of Parkchester today.
Oh, Parkchester.
Yeah. And it was an AME church. As far as I know, the first in the area of today's Bronx.
Yeah.
Built in the 1840s. And I forget what its original name was, but eventually they changed it to Centerville AME. But it maybe was Mount Zion AME before that, something like that. But yeah, I'm gonna look myself.
AME Zion was a common name.
It's hard to find information about those years of the church because of that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I'm sure there was overlap in communication.
Yeah.
I think of necessity, black communities leaned on each other heavily. And in my research, I've found, if black communities are within 4 and 5 miles of one another, definitely there would be a common place of worship, lots of intermarriage, definitely. So that's something I gotta look into.
Yeah.
If you could give me some literature on that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, sir.
Oh, just a comment. It's interesting in Scarrowville that the Irish and blacks were together in the neighborhood. And I think in Northwest Connecticut, her great-great-great-grandmother from Ireland was married to a black man in 1860. He unfortunately died in the Civil War fighting for the Connecticut Black Regiment. And now it makes sense. And up in the hills of Northwest Connecticut, blacks and whites were together to some extent.
It's odd. I mean, we hear about the riots, we hear about the bloodshed, we hear about the violence, but there was also a lot of romance. You know?
It's natural.
A lot, you know, and so there's, you know, genetically we're a lot more blended
And I said the same
than other
thing.
people, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
You have the existence of a farm over by Jacoby
Yeah.
and stuff, and I know about some farming that is east of Eastchester Road and things like that. Do you know about any black farms east there, like down by the Hudson River Parkway or by where Freedom Land used to be, around that
Yeah.
area?
I did not find any in that area. But again, the way I searched for these things was very unscientific. There's really not a scientific way to approach it yet because the data wasn't being kept. And so, you know, there are plenty of nuggets out there that I simply haven't discovered. I mean, you can only go over the census so many times. You know, you get to page 200 and, you know, like I'm sure I missed quite a few.
I mean, there are so
But
many.
this story of Schuylerville, this story of Dennis Hetty, to me, were very compelling. Two of the most compelling. And so I decided to present that.
Yeah.
But to my knowledge, no. But I always, you know, with the disclaimer that I don't know everything by any means. Yes, sir.
On the censuses, I noticed that the gentleman he had an M, which was mulatto,
Yeah.
and we have W for white,
Yeah.
but this lecture is about black landowners. Are there any B's next to any of the names on the censuses?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
And all
Or B
of
or N or any other letter denoting a person of color?
it's.
I only ask because I
it-
saw that little piece right
Yeah, it's all B.
there. So B's?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's all E.
Okay.
Yeah. Even Dennis Hetty, who we know was mixed race,
Right.
is a B.
One drop.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure if I missed it in the captions, but in the slides on the waterlogged land, you mentioned that it caused the current 49th precinct to lose its parking lot?
No. They were just expanding
Oh,
their
it's-
parking lot, so they were laying a foundation.
Oh, okay, I thought something fell, never mind.
I wouldn't be surprised if the water is causing problems, you know. I'm not sure, I don't think I'd be buying property, you know. But, yes?
I think I unfortunately probably already know the answer to this, but has there been any movement, or do you envision in the future any movement to try to like officially recognize some of these historic places, especially for the homes that are still there?
Not yet, but I hope to initiate something like that.
Yeah, even if it's just a
that's
plaque with the date and the name.
Yeah, I found there was a large community in Yonkers on the border with Hastings on Hudson that I've done a lot of work on, and I'm going to be publishing it in the Journal of the Early Republic, and probably it'll come out like in a year from now. So that is one of the most coherent and communities that I've studied, and I'm going to push for a monument there, for sure. And I know that the local historical society and the town of Greenberg, which Hastings is part of, are both on board with the idea.
Yeah, I think that you, depending on how much time you have a tremendous amount of work ahead of you with this topic. Because I
Oh,
think
man.
that
So much.
there are probably other pieces of information floating around that if you were able to backtrack, you might find that there were also landowners. For instance, I years ago found out that in St. Peter's Church,
Yeah.
up by the Salvation Army
Yeah,
there are two graves in there of black people who died in the Civil War.
exactly.
And
Many times, that was the case in Yonkers, where I went backwards from families that had veterans, like multiple veterans, and found that they were landowners. There were no deeds, there was no census record, but I was able to figure it out for military records, that the family had influenced money. Yes?
How did you get interested in doing this particular research? How did you get started?
I stumbled on it. You know, I'm actually I'm trained in art history. So like really I mostly know about building architecture. So I know about old building, you know, like I love this building, you know. I was researching a building and I was going through the old property deeds and the year was like 1814 or something. And the property deeds mentioned that the farm of black men was adjacent to that, the farm that the house was standing on, and I was like, hang on, like it's 1816, you know what I mean? Slavery was not abolished until 1827. There's a black man who owns a farm, and that was kind of really fascinating to me, because I don't think that generally speaking, people have a feeling you know, that in 1816, you had black landowners, much less black businessmen with flourishing businesses that went on for decades. You know, the focus is always on manumission, emancipation, and on slavery, and yet there was this other side to the story. The black experience was more complicated than maybe we imagined. And so I thought that was very interesting. So I pursued that, and then I mentioned it to Historical Society, and they were like, oh wow, and they loved the idea. So, and everybody loves the idea, you know, so like, you know, so like, I'm invited to give this lecture in like 5 places, you know, and it's great, you know, it's great. It's just a whole area of like history that just hasn't been explored. And it's, yeah. So I would like to change that, or at least address that these stories are out there, you know, and there's lots of them. So, anyways, yeah.
I'm not sure if this is clear based on your mentioning of racism
Mhm.
and like being on the rise towards the end of your speech here. I wonder whether or not there were any like dips or any negative fluctuation in black land ownership, or whether it actually has just been on the rise ever since.
In New York,
In Bronx.
in the Bronx, I don't know. I know that in the mid 19th century, so like 1840 to say 1880, there was a drop. There was a drop, and I think it's because this promise of abolition didn't work out. You know, because the white establishment would not accept black men as apprentices in the trades that a poor person would usually use to become middle class properly.
And the population of the North probably increased after the Civil War. I wonder if that led to a backlash as well. Probably.
Quite likely.
So,
Quite likely, but I'm not sure what the story is in the Bronx in say, like 1925 or 1950. You know, it may have been very different.
so
Yeah.
despite the population of black people increasing, their land ownership did decrease for that period of time.
In the mid 19th century, so 1850, 1860. Yeah. So that's more or less the deal, everybody. I very much appreciate you coming out in the snow. And
Thank you very much for presenting. Thank you all for being here, and just want to put on y'all's radar, some of you may have registered. We have a book talk next week on Paradise Bronx. Unfortunately, all 140 tickets are booked up for it, but you know.
If you give us money now.
Anyway, but that's going on. So if some of you registered, hope to see you there. March 8th, we have an event on International Women's Day on the history of African American domestic workers and their struggle for a union in the Bronx. It's history like from 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So check out our website for information on that. It's a free event. Just register for a ticket, bronxhistory.org. And we have a lot of other events coming up too. But yeah, check us out. Great to see all of you here. And yeah, let us know if you have any questions. And let's give our presenter another round of applause. You want to take a picture? Roger, you want to get up here?
Should I do this?
Yeah, sure.